Okay. Hi guys, welcome back. Now that we've finished our introductory lesson, we've learnt about what culture is and we've looked at material and non-material aspects of culture. We now want to start being a little bit more specific and looking at what this area of study asks us to, which is Australian Indigenous culture. So the first dot point on your study design for VCE is myths and misconceptions about Aboriginal culture. So today we're going to do a little bit of myth busting. So first we are going to go through what a misconception is. We're going to look at three particular misconceptions about Australian Indigenous culture. In class, you're going to do some research about what your peers know or don't know about these misconceptions. And you'll need to be able to explain why they're incorrect. Okay, so we first need to have a look at what a misconception is. I just need to make sure that we're all familiar with the term. So the definition is a view or opinion that is incorrect and based on a lack of understanding. Just means something that's wrong, something that's false. But the idea that it's based on a lack of understanding is important, because the misconceptions we'll see about Aboriginal culture are simply because there's a lack of understanding of information and of education by a lot of white Australians about Aboriginal Australians. So, as I've said down here, many public misconceptions exist about Australian Indigenous culture. This means that Australian Indigenous culture is not well understood by the rest of Australia. And Australians, non-Indigenous Australians, hold many perceptions about Australia's history and Indigenous people and culture that are untrue. So we need to sort all those out. We'll be using a lot of these terms throughout the unit, so I've just included a little bit of a note on terminology. This is also replicated in the textbook that we're working from. So when we say Indigenous Australian, we use this as a generic term mostly, so that can refer to both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The Torres Strait is up here in off the coast of very far north Queensland. So people that come from there are called Torres Strait Islanders, and Aboriginal people are Indigenous people from mainland Australia and Tasmania as well. Okay, so Indigenous people from the Torres Strait Islanders, Aboriginal people from the mainland of Tassie, they're Aboriginal. If you're referring to them generically, then you might use Indigenous Australian. Within that, you might also hear the term Koori being used in Victoria. That's a term that is specifically a Victorian term, one that just applies to our state. You might see it spelled with or without an E, and that also means Aboriginal people from Victoria. There's lots of ongoing debate about the language used around Aboriginal Australians. And this is from protocols from Koori Education in Victorian primary and secondary schools, which kind of sums it up. So they've said some Australian Indigenous people prefer to be called Aboriginal, while others prefer Indigenous. From our community perspective, there has been a shift away from the term Indigenous in favour of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander and sometimes First Nations peoples. You'll certainly note if you see Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people in the media, they will often introduce themselves as a person of the Aboriginal nation where they're from, just shown on this map. These are all of the different Aboriginal nations within Australia. So, for example, where I grew up in the ACT, a lot of that land is Ngunnawal land. And so an Aboriginal person from that area might say, "Hello, my name is whoever, and I am a Ngunnawal woman." So, that's a way of perhaps not using these terms at all. Okay, I hope that's clear. Now, in class, you'll be doing a research task to look at some of the myths and misconceptions involving Australian Indigenous culture, and you'll be surveying your peers You will come back with results and we'll see how well or how poorly some Tarneit Senior College students understand Australian Indigenous culture. Once you come back with that data, we'll be looking at these 3 myths that we're focusing on, and we want to bust them. Okay. So the first myth or misconception about Australian Indigenous culture that we want to look at is Australia was land that belonged to no one. And so this means specifically that the land belonged to no one when the Europeans arrived in 1788. Right, so sorry, from straight up, let's say this is a myth. And this has been proven a myth actually very scientifically. So there's scientific evidence from a variety of sources, including DNA evidence, that suggests that Aboriginal people have been in Australia, arriving here from various African nations at least 50,000 years ago. And if you read different things, sometimes that will say 60 or 80,000 or even up to 100,000 years ago, depending on the source. Regardless, this is such a long time that Aboriginal people are actually the oldest continuous civilization on Earth, which is amazing. So in terms of, the idea that it was land that belonged to no one, European settlement in 1788, it's hard again to get exact estimates, but it's estimated that anywhere from 300,000 to over 1 million Aboriginal people lived in Australia. They lived in harmony with each other and the land, and they had a rich cultural and ritual life. So basically, everything was just fine. There are about 400 nations, and this is really important. Oral title deeds existed that set out the parameters of these tribal areas. So when it's this idea that land belonged to no one, that's simply not true. And it's not true necessarily because of, what we in white Australian culture might expect, written laws or contracts or title deeds, but it was done orally. So these were spoken. These were understood between nations that said, this is our land, this is your land, the boundaries of this land are from here to here. These were all widely understood by Aboriginal people who were far and wide hugely peaceful people. So they were expressed in story, songs and ceremony. All of these protocols were understood by everyone, so there were no problems when it came to division of land. They knew who owned which bits of land. Then the British got here. They ignored all of that. They declared Australia to be, this is the famous term, terra nullius, which loosely translates to no man's land. And they said, right, thanks very much. This is ours now. We're going to take it for the Queen. This is going to be ours for the British government. And they did this without the consent of Australia's owners and often using weapons and force. So they completely disregarded all of these oral titles, all of the understanding that Aboriginal people had, and they took it for themselves. Okay. The second myth that's quite common is that Indigenous people are a homogenous group. Before we get into it, let's just define this word, homogenous. So homogenous, when something is homogenous, if we literally break down the word, homo means same and genus is from the word type. So it literally means same type. Heterogeneous or heterogeneous means different type. So if Indigenous people are a homogenous group, that means that they're the same. This is not true. They're made up of a whole hundreds and hundreds of different and very diverse groups. So at the time of colonisation, so when the settlers arrived, there were about 500 different nations, like we saw on that map earlier. Within each of those nations, there were distinct cultures, there were distinct traditions, and often very distinct languages. And a lot of that diversity is still here today. So there are hundreds of different Aboriginal nations, and one will have different culture and tradition and language to another. At the moment, today, there's about 250 to 300 different languages spoken by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander groups. So, this idea that, oh, they're all the same, Aboriginal people are X or are Y, is simply not true. They are made up of diverse and different nations of people, distinct language and culture. Last one. Oh, that's just the map again. So we can see the huge diversity here. Individual nations, individual culture, individual languages. This third one, Indigenous people live in the desert. This kind of comes up a lot in city areas or in suburban areas, particularly where there aren't large Aboriginal populations. So if you grew up, and I probably had held this misconception when I was young. I grew up in a city where I don't think that I knew any other Aboriginal people, and I probably would have believed that they mainly lived in the desert, that they lived in rural areas. Many Australians think this, but there are statistics state that more than a third of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders do live in capital cities. So it's not a majority, but it's far, far more than people think. And if we break that down by areas within Australia, so if you look at where we are, somewhere like Melbourne, half of Aboriginal people are living, in Melbourne. They aren't living in the desert in, far off rural places. Most of them are living in the city with us. They aren't separate. Now, you notice this does change a bit by state. Obviously, in Canberra, almost all of Aboriginal people are living in the city. And then if you look at the Northern Territory and Queensland, the figures are a little bit lower because there are just a lot more rural areas in those states. However, the idea that, all Aboriginal people live in the desert, they all live up in the middle of Alice Springs at the base of Uluru, is just not true. Okay, there's a great BuzzFeed video on some myths and misconceptions there that we can have a look at. We'll hopefully have some time to watch the ABC iView series, You Can't Ask That. So if we go back again to our learning intention, we want to define the term misconception. We did that. We looked at 3 misconceptions about Australian Indigenous culture. So we looked at them living in the desert or in rural and remote areas. We looked at the myth of them being a homogenous group. And we looked at the myth of the land belonging to no one when Europeans arrived. We busted all those myths, and we can now explain why they're incorrect. And in class, you will have had a research task to enable you to meet those outcomes as well. Okay, thanks very much. See you next lesson. Bye-bye.